Hello, I'm the Culture Genie. This video is going to deal with the topic of the types of labor throughout history. I'm mainly going to do an overview of 5 types of labor. Free labor, the concept of serfdom, slavery, debt bondage, and forced state labor as 5 categories that I will go through in this video. Again, this will be more of an overview than anything else, and I will go more in depth in these types of labors in later videos. The first type of labor that we will discuss is going to be free labor. I will start with this type of labor as it is a type of labor that is still around in the modern industrial world and is in fact the dominant type of labor in the industrialized world. Free labor means to sell one's work in exchange for monetary gain through formally free contracts and agreements. i.e., you are not forced to accept any contracts or agreements about work by outside force. Free laborers are those that are selling their work for pay or own the land they work on as free farmers. I'm including free farmers as free laborers here as a simplification. They kind of operate on the same principle of selling their labor or products. Free labor is actually not that rare throughout history, and it was actually pretty common. It's only more unusual as being the dominant form of labor or the only form of labor as is the case now in more modern times in the West. As I will discuss in the coming types of labor, there have existed other types of labor that have been just as common as free labor throughout history. And the commonality of free labor varies greatly depending very much upon where you look in history and in which cultures you look upon. This also means that the factors and standards of free labor are also very changeable depending upon various historical contexts. Thus, I will not go into any details in this video about various contexts and conditions. Now, let us move to another type of labor, serfdom and serfs. First thing first, serfs were not slaves. Though they sometimes could be in very abusive situations, they were not legally slaves. Slavery is something else which I will describe later as something very different from serfdom. Serfdom as a concept is in its most simplest term a kind of agreement, either informal or formal, that you and your family is allowed to work on the fields of the owner of the land or the controller or holder in order to sustain yourself and your family in exchange for various services. The landlord did not have to be a noble either, as both the church in the West and the landowning mosque congregations in the Middle East with their endowments could act as local landlords and go into agreements with various families. The services that you were supposed to provide as a serf could be in the form of a tribute or tax in the form of the produce that went beyond feeding your family, or it could be a set amount that you had to produce for your lord. Serf conditions could be extremely varied as they were based on agreements between families and not standardized contracts in most cases. Another type of service that you usually had to do in a serfdom agreement was military service to the local lord, though sometimes the opposite was true. Through being bonded as a serf to the land or to the lord, you could escape forced conscription. Sometimes, or rather often in some cases, even the landlords themselves were forced to provide protection to their serfs by the obligations involved in the serfdom. Serfdom and the agreements could be very varied across both history and cultures, but also in every separate case, as serfdom was often an individual agreement between families. Though there were also sometimes the case that there existed standardizations about agreements and contracts. Primarily examples are Russia and much of the history of the Arabic world with the Laccohee endowments. A way of seeing serfdom is to see it almost as having a rental contract that goes through several generations, where your great-grandfather agreed something with the family of the landowners, or the landlord if it's another entity, and thus both of your families are bound to this contract/agreement. Sometimes the agreement was even bound to the land itself, so if for example a land-owning noble was to sell the land, the next one would not be able to kick away the people working there. On the flip side, you were also usually obligated to stay and work the land to do what had been promised by your ancestor in this intergenerational agreement. Remember, there were large differences between various types of serfdom, and through time, so a lot of the conditions and mistreatment associated with serfdom was not always the case, or it was due to very specific conditions. I would even say that in the majority of cases, serfdom was actually kind of okay for their time and context. In fact, there even existed cases where free farmers went into serfdom to escape taxation, as in they sold their property to the landlord and worked as a serf for the landlord, as the local nobility, and thus serfs bound to them, could be free from taxes. Thus it was a kind of a way to do a tax evasion, or forced conscriptions if free farmers were obligated by law to be conscripted. So it was a way to escape that in certain cases, at least in certain kingdoms. Now there also existed extremely brutal and exploitative forms of serfdom, but it is important to know that serfdom could be extremely varied, and it did bring certain benefits outside of just the right to use the land. Now let's move to the next form of labor, slavery and slaves. Slavery is the institutional idea that humans are property that can be sold and bought, in other words, traded like cattle. It is important to note that slavery historically has been a very widespread practice from ancient time even to recent times. For example, the ancient peoples practiced slavery, and Mauritania and Sudan had legal slavery until very recently, as an example. Due to being such a widespread practice, the conditions of slaves have varied greatly depending on both culture, time and function of the slave. Conditions have varied from not being that bad to making even the American slavery with regular beatings and whippings looking like paradise in comparison. Seriously, there existed cultures and times where slaves were regularly sacrificed to deities, killed in regular cullings, killed as a form of entertainment, sent out to be hunted in hunting games, and regularly castrated. There has existed a plethora of nasty types of slavery through history. Although saying this, conditions of slavery were very dependent upon what type of work a slave was doing and how costly a slave was. A costly slave doing some sort of intellectual labor such as a teacher is not going to live in the same conditions as a slave on plantations or in the mines. How slaves were treated could vary greatly depending upon a multitude of factors, such as the previously mentioned skills of the slaves, if the individual slave owner was harsh or not, and there usually existed laws regarding the treatment of slaves. And these laws have of course been different in different times and in different cultures. But we should still remember that in societies with slavery, humans are property and are not legally people as we would understand it. Now we are going to go into bonded debt labor. Bonded debt labor is the concept of being forced to work for the one you are in debt to, due to having to pay back a loan or some other debt according to contract stipulations. A famous example of this type of labor would be the use of Irish debt labor during the early history of the United States. Another example from the United States would also be that a lot of the freed slaves after the American Civil War were forced into this type of labor afterwards through various means. Of course, this form of labor is still existent to this day in certain parts of the world. Some would call this debt slavery, but it's still different from true slavery, even though debts can be sold and bought, and thus the obligations to work that goes with those contracts are also moved. But usually this means that a part of the debt was paid off, and the one in debt was one step closer to freedom. You also usually had at least some legal protections against maltreatment, which usually did not exist in slavery, at least not in the same way. In debt bonded labor, you are still a legal person, not a piece of property, legally speaking. Sometimes a debt could also not even be sold without the consent of the one in debt or the party in the contract. It depended upon the contract and the laws which were in place. Of course, it was not unheard of that certain actors throughout history tried to get people into spirals of ever more debt and thus ever more unpaid work. I don't deny this, but it was still different from slavery that was practiced in the South of America or elsewhere, at least in a legal sense. You did not sell yourself as property still, like in certain forms of slavery where you did sell yourself in order to get rid of debts. though it should be admitted that sometimes the differences are not that large. And now to the final type of labor, forced state labor, where the state forces one to do work without payment or just a bare minimum, but the individuals in question are not sold off as property like in regular slavery. I treat slavery and general state labor in a historical sense as being different due to there not being a market for selling the laborers in question as property, and that the legal status of forced state labor is different. Though it should be mentioned that certain forms of forced state labor are legally considered slavery according to Geneva Conventions and the UN's Human Rights Charter regarding forced labor and prisoners of war. Forced state labor can be just as bad as more privatized slavery. On the subject of prisoners of war, the most common reason historically for being subject to forced state labor was due to being a prisoner of war. Though forced state labor can be due to various other reasons than just the war. We have, for example, prison labor, which is the case in the United States, but also in a lot of other countries have done this both historically and still do this. We also have forced state labor as part of various governmental programs, like the 5-year plans in the Soviet Union that sometimes needed forced labor, but also in older times. China, ancient Egypt and ancient Persia used forced labor for large projects. You also have the corvée systems of several European countries. This sort of forced state labor often was a sort of taxation. Instead of paying money, you paid in labor, especially before currencies were common. This was an alternative to taxing people in money. You also have forced state labor of ethnic groups as parts of genocide or suppression. Well, the Nazis and the Soviets did this, but they were not the only ones. South America and the Assyrians, Sweden during several periods in history were all places where this was done. I have mentioned several reasons for forced state labor. These different sorts of forced state labor could even be considered their own categories of labor, but I have chosen to present them as the same thing here due to not wanting to get too bogged down into details in this overview. Now I have gone through these 5 types of labor, but in order to simplify it some more, let's go to a simple overview in order to clarify differences. As you can see on the screen, this is an overview of the types of labor, with various aspects in which they are different or not different. Let's start with the first aspect. Is the labor paid? For free labor, of course it's paid. It's in the definition of free labor that you're paid for your labor in return for doing your services or producing goods. What about serfdom then? Yes, you're actually paid in a way. You get to use the land as payment for actually being bound to it, and you get to keep some of the produce that you produce as a serf farmer. You also get protection usually, and there could be other benefits. So yes, you get some sort of payment, though it was usually not monetary. As for what regards slavery, no, slaves were usually not paid. Though there existed exceptions where slaves were sold into slavery due to debts, and then slavery overlaps somewhat with debt bondage. Thus you paid off your debt with some labor. And that actually goes into the next sort of labor, debt bondage, where yes, your labor goes into paying off your debt according to the stipulations of whatever debt contract you had. Now, with regard to forced state labor, no, or usually minimally, but sometimes it's important to consider that you are doing labor instead of doing monetary taxes. So it is kind of doing a tax payment. Now to the second aspect, the individual is sold on the market. In free labor, no, you're selling your services, not yourself. In serfdom, no, you are not sold as an individual. You are still a free man, even if you're bound to land. In slavery, yes, of course you're sold as property. And in debt bondage, yes, but usually only with consent of the one in debt or for better pay, as there usually existed laws and stipulations with regard to selling a debt. And with forced state labor, no. Then we are moving to the matter of if the individual is a legal entity in this type of labor. In free labor, yes, as you're selling your services as an individual. In serfdom, no. The family is the legal entity that decides the agreement, i.e. it's between the family of the serf and the family of the landlords or landholding entity. In slavery, no, you are not a legal individual in the normal sense, usually. In forced state labor, it really depends upon why the forced state labor is done and the contexts around it. The next aspect is, can the labor leave his career or work? In free labor, yes, as long as there exists no obligations due to some contract or something. In serfdom, no, the serf is bound to the land and to the agreement between his family and the land holding entity. In slavery, no, the slave is property with no self-governance. In debt bondage, no, but if the debt bonded laborer is presented with a better work opportunity, then there was usually the case that he could do work there and pay the debt through that instead. That was a usual stipulation in many debt contracts and the laws regarding debt bondage. Either way, usually the focus was upon the debt being paid. In forced state labor, no, the laborer cannot leave when he wants, as it is forced by definition. The next aspect is if there exists obligations from the employer/taskmaster. For free labor, yes, and it depends on the contract or agreement. In serfdom, the answer is yes, and it depends upon the familial agreements. As a serf, for example, as long as you upheld your obligations, you were obligated to be able to use the land. In slavery, usually no. As what regards debt bondage, it depended upon the contract and which kind of obligations the debt holder had to give you if he was the work provider. In forced state labor, usually no, but then again, if you did the forced labor as part of tax payment, then you could do the labor instead of paying taxes. The next aspect, if there exists time limits upon the labor. How long do you have to work in this type of labor as part of your life? In free labor, there exist time limits, yes, and it depends upon the contract or deals you have made. In serfdom, no. The idea is that the serf contract transcends the individual, as it is a familial contract. So you are bound to still work as a serf for your entire life. Of course, there usually existed agreements like if you're too old to work, you are no longer forced to work, but those are kind of an exception and does not involve itself with working life. In slavery, no, but it depends upon the local laws. For example, the Israelites usually released slaves during each Jubilee year. As for debt bondage, depends upon the contract, usually until the debt is paid, but could be defined with clear time limits. In regard to forced state labor, it really depends upon the case. Sometimes, yes, you had a time limit, for example, working just a couple of days or weeks. Sometimes it was perpetual. And the last aspect, in which type of societies were these types of labor used? Free labor was used pretty much everywhere. Serfdom was used in societies usually with pretty weak central states. You had to rely on familial agreements in order to ensure your own security and prosperity. Slavery has been pretty common as a concept, but slave societies where slavery is the dominant form of labor economically have only arisen in more advanced pre-industrial societies. The reasons for this I will go into in a later video. Debt bondage can only exist in a society that has a strong state, as you need a state to ensure that contracts are followed. And the same requirement of a strong state or central power is also the case with forced state labor, as it requires a strong state in order to force the laborers to work, at least in any large-scale capacity. Free labor, serfdom, slavery, debt bondage, and forced state labor. So these are the 5 types of labor that we have gone through in this video. Hopefully this overview of the types of labor have been useful and can be useful to you in the future, especially when you're discussing certain types of politics in the past. Hopefully this video was informative and entertaining to you as well, my dear viewers and listeners. Please do subscribe, as it would help the channel spread awareness about the humanities. اشترك بالقناة من فضلكم.